Ok, caros estudantes, nós estamos agora dando continuidade ao curso do professor Kellogg. Eu gostaria muito de agradecer a vocês a participação. Estou absolutamente convencido de que é um curso que é do mais alto interesse, não só se tratando da pessoa que é o professor Kellogg, uma autoridade internacional, mas pela pertinência que o assunto suscita entre nós. Portanto, mais uma vez, muito obrigado pela sua participação. E eu vou passar a palavra ao professor Kellogg. Kellogg?
Yes.
Okay.
Welcome.
You could start. Okay.
Welcome to the third lecture on democracy and social conflict, how we govern ourselves between elections. We're on how social conflict provides a means of human control by the electoral process. We started in the first lecture with quotations from three figures: Kenneth Arrow, Friedrich Hayek, and John Dewey. Both Arrow and Hayek presented impossibility problems for the mechanisms of democratic freedom. That is, for elections and voting as a means of public choice, even questioning majoritarian legislation. Arrow saw a world of fixed preferences with no hope for rational resolution by voting or anything but dictatorial authority. That led to the gloomy view of Professor Alan Feldman that Arrow's thesis, quote, casts doubts on all assertions that there is a general will, a social contract, a social good, a will of the people, a people's government, a people's voice, and on vast areas of 20th century social thought. End quote. World of spontaneous ordering with no clear path for what he called rational constructivism, meaning human design governing the intricate complexity of human society. Hayek threw even more doubt onto the whole idea of majoritarian legislation, with the assumption that it is like an architect building from scratch with insufficient information to resolve complicated problems. But Hayek's colleague at the University of Chicago, Frank Knight, could not accept that extreme denial of any human direction or control. Now, let's wonder, could these two extreme views of impossibility be contributing to our great polarization, the polarization of views of our society, to the current widespread doubts about liberal democracy and government itself? What are the origins of this situation? The philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre says in his excellent and influential book, After Virtue, that politics and philosophy, ideas and reality, are deeply connected. Ideas are tested in the real world. He writes, quote, "It is in its historical encounter that any given point of view establishes or fails to establish its rational superiority relative to its rivals. The great polarization is both a result of the failure of old ideas and a condition that calls for new ideas. That is the very reason why John Dewey's philosophy is so necessary. Its relevance to the new world of politics and law. Frank Knight could not come up with a program for democratic discussion in the conceptual world that he shared with Friedrich Hayek. If only he could have gotten together at Chicago University with the scholar Edward Levy, who inferred a Deweyan model from the history of law. The last lecture, in a study of law and legal history, offered an alternative understanding to both kinds of impossibility. It was presented as a pragmatist response to the debate between Hayek and his colleague Frank Knight at the University of Chicago. If they'd gotten together, perhaps Levy could have suggested to Knight, from legal history, how the intricate texture of human affairs had been built up gradually and experimentally, rather than somehow occurring spontaneously, and thus providing some room for improvement, including both custom and Knight's constructive discussion. This opens our eyes to the nature and importance of John Dewey's concept of a transformative continuum. Last week, I read passages from Levy's 1949 study of the history of legal justice concerning injury from dangerous instrumentalities. I said, leave long inquiry, but other inquiries may have rather different stages. Nevertheless, the continuum does not usually proceed to an immediate resolution, a balance of good and bad consequences, as utilitarian theory assumes. Levy's three stages are unique to that particular inquiry. The important point is that stages or phases, including the sense of uncertainty, are inevitable. Clearly, in many inquiries, there are also areas of vulnerability where discussion can be abused and the path of decisions derailed. Interest groups will seek to push the path of every inquiry in their favor. But Levy reveals how feedback, not just from the injured parties and the interest groups, but from the community, influences the course of inquiry. As we saw in that process, the continuum does more than resolving conflict. It may engender a gradual transformation of language and even thought. Hence, the connection between conflict, preference change, and the ongoing transformation of habit, language, and even how a society thinks. So, it raises larger questions than just democracy and self-government. It raises questions of philosophy. The young Japanese novelist Miko Kawakami has just written a new book titled simply Heaven. The main characters are two children in middle school, a boy of 40 bullied by older boys for their personal and physical defects. The boy has a birth defect that is titled Heaven. But the bullying is far from heavenly. The two children are harassed and often severely beaten. But because they have no defense, they talk with each other about its meaning for their lives and their desire, as Kawakami says, to impart clarity and depth to their suffering. Like many of us, they want to understand a desperate situation. Kawakami is an exciting young female novelist from Japan who became fascinated with philosophy as a young child and eventually put this fascination into wonderfully resonant works of fiction, incorporating problems that philosophy has wrestled with for centuries. To the question of why these two children are suffering, philosopher Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche. Nietzsche's view of morality was grounded in power. Kawakami does not reject this idea, but instead she investigates it. She traces how terms of moral value change with power, and how good and evil, or pain and pleasure, get attached to ordinary human interactions. Relativism of morals is a prominent theme here. Nietzsche challenged the foundations of Christianity and traditional morality. He believed in life, creativity, power, and what he saw as the stark realities of the world we live in, rather than in the spiritual world beyond. For many readers, Nietzsche is the prophet of moral relativism. I think Dewey's transformative continuum actually speaks to the situation in Kawakami's novel and fills an important gap in the conventional idea of relativism. I think it does so in a way that is unique to philosophy. Kawakami portrays how debilitating the lack of moral certainty can be, especially at age 14. But what about the very process that we are studying, the stages of moral inquiry and the nature of uncertainty? I mentioned 2 weeks ago that relativism is associated with indeterminacy. The concept of indeterminacy leads to relativism and the attitude that nothing can be done. It is easily seen as a permanent entity, an unavoidable condition of reality. Not so, say I, if it is seen instead as uncertainty, a stage or a phase of inquiry in the context of the continuum. Understanding the stages of inquiry is the key to understanding the problem of foundations. Foundations for social action are rooted in habits and history. Adjustment and revision is complicated, but to rebuild, we have to get through uncertainty. Relativism is an abandonment of responsibility. Work is required in getting toward transformation. John Dewey was quite aware of this, that group habits and preferences. I distinguished uncertainty from indeterminacy, and I think Kawakami's novel demonstrates the importance of this distinction, and also the importance of the continuum of inquiry and its ability to change preferences, to change habits. What is the habit that preoccupies the characters in her novel, what indeed is bullying? Is it a habit? Think for a minute about bullying and its prominence throughout the world and human history. If in fact bullying were a habit, a human habit that was subject to transformation and change, civilization. We're now seeing that the question is, how can habits be changed and how can they be directed in order to become better? As Frank Knight wondered, where is the value? Kawakami as a writer, Nietzsche's relativism dictates acceptance, but for her characters, it is clearly an inadequate response, an inadequate philosophy. Alternative philosophy dictates a pragmatist, but her book is very relevant to our focus on. In asking such questions about bullying, she opens up an issue that should concern us. How do problems get defined? How do they get recognized? Is bullying a habit that can be addressed? How far does bullying extend in society? How about sexual aggression and racist aggression, revenge, and even war? I think Kawakami's novel raises these questions all the more powerfully as we follow the torture to which the two children are subjected in her novel. We now turn to John Dewey's view of community and the pragmatist vision of society as continuous inquiry. The details of legal inquiry were examined last week to show what Dewey called the transformative continuum, how continuous inquiry into particular problems is driven by disagreement and dispute, and how it operates largely independent of the electoral process that both Arrow and Hayek mistrusted. We know that social conflict can be disruptive. It can also be constructive. We now, in this lecture, can consider Dewey's insights for a realistic and saving way forward. At the same time, are finding ourselves in a state of profound uncertainty and conflict. There's single we in this world. Our lives are disrupted by a global health crisis that threatens us individually and also economically on a planet that seems in a desperate climate crisis, requiring urgent, concerted action. And there is disruption also by the global polarization of disagreement over how and even whether to respond. Meanwhile, failures of elected leadership and government are turning many toward authority and dictatorship. Earlier, runs, quote, "There is no sanctity in universal suffrage, frequent election, government. They are not the whole of the democratic idea, but they express it in its political phase. Regarded as an idea," Dewey says, democracy is not life, it is the idea of community life itself. How can we understand that idea in the midst of our own crisis? We must first examine it in the context of Dewey's own time, one that was also filled with uncertainty, with national and global crisis, with many parallels to our own time. It included a great debate over the role of government and the ideological struggle of capitalism against fascism, socialism, and communism. There were two world wars, the ensuing Cold War, and the anti-communism scare in the United States, fomented by a senator named Joseph McCarthy. Given that turmoil and the conflict of ideologies, what real chance was there for an organic democracy in Dewey's own lifetime? How about in ours? Dewey was actively engaged as a public intellectual, trying to relate his pragmatic philosophy to the contemporary problems of his time. He constantly sought to define organic democracy in workable terms, to the industrial workplace, to the educational system, to a democratic socialism. Socialism was a term that was always flexible for Dewey, but he never abandoned it. Did he succeed in convincing others and leaving a legacy for us? He was constantly attacked, as well as often ignored and misunderstood. The transformative continuum, was it workable? Dewey failed to get a clear vision across to his many critics. On the eve of the Second World War, in 1940, a distinguished accused Dewey of undermining the absolute values required to mount resistance to fascism and communism. Adler appealed to vague but absolute truths. The most serious threat to democracy, he said, is the, quote, positivism of the professors, which dominates every aspect of modern education, of culture, according to Adler. Until Dewey and his ilk were liquidated, the resolution of modern problems will not even begin, said Adler. Strong language, appealing to absolute values is nothing new, then as now. It is often used without articulating what the absolutes are or how they apply. And Adler was a respected professor, famous for his advocacy of reading the great books of Western civilization. What was Adler's positivism of the professors? It was what Dewey called his empirical naturalism. The two principal elements of empirical naturalism are, first, an emphasis on basing knowledge on factual human experience, not limited to laboratory experiments, but extending to all human experience. Second, naturalism emphasizes the primacy of natural experience over the supernatural and abstract. In responding to absolutes, naturalism asks hard questions. Subtly, do they mean? Moral absolutists, like Professor Adler, have a refrain that is highlighted by Kawakami's novel, The Fearsome Monster of Relativism. It says, if you don't agree that there are moral absolutes, you're a relativist. The term was repeatedly used against Dewey. It was used against another famous reasons. Empirical naturalism came directly from the founders of pragmatism, especially William James and the young Justice Holmes. James's radical empiricism looked beyond scientific objects and physical objects and included the relations between objects and all experience, even thought. Dewey believed that the world had suffered from an inability to extend empirical naturalism beyond the object-obsessed natural sciences to make its advantages more broadly recognized and available. Until we apply it to the terrain of ethics, said Dewey, the door is open to moral absolutism. If you confine reality to physical objects, you leave values in the realm of pure feeling. This is the fact-value dichotomy, a long-standing commitment of analytical philosophy. For clarity, let's now just call it, as values are not facts. If values aren't really real, there's no way to apply science or scientific inquiry to values and ethics. But this is asking the wrong question. The right one is whether values properly draw on human experience, and if so, how best to put that insight to work. Where does this attitude that values are not factual come from? The philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre will help us to clarify this. We have already explored legal problems and how they are resolved through successive judgments. It is not that different from seeing science as a process of resolving a physical problem by successive experiments. This should help us understand Dewey better than his contemporaries did when he tried to explain its importance. Excluding values from scientific methods left them fair game for ideologues. Here's what Dewey said in 1941. The claim to possession of final truths is an appeal to arbitrate by force. When the claim to possession of truth by which life should be directed is asserted to have its origin outside of anything in actual experience, and when the claim is asserted to be incapable of being tested by anything in experience, and nevertheless different systems are asserted to possess ultimate truth, there is no practicable way of negotiating the differences. The only way out is trial by force, giving the side having superior force the ability to impose acceptance of its dogmas. Dewey actually said this in a lecture on December 7th, 1941, the day of the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Dewey criticized this factual narrowness for its repudiation of a role for scientific method in ethical judgment. He said, quote, "This is the problem which we are compelled to face if we ask whether human behavior is capable of being directed by other means and either superior force, external authority, or sheer emotional outbursts, not controlled by authenticated ideas." What was Dewey driving at in making ethics more scientific? It seems that we should inherit a clearer idea of what he meant by this. And yet, as I read the record and contemporary commentary, I find too little clarification. Even intellectuals who shared many of Dewey's insights have failed to grasp its full implications. A similar thing happened to Justice Holmes, another empirical naturalist, though he never heard that phrase. Holmes was criticized for putting experience in law ahead of absolutes, and he was called, as recently as 1999, a moral relativist, an advocate of law without values. Dewey's conception of extending empirical naturalism from science to ethics is not simple to explain or describe. It has much to do with the subject of habit, especially habits of thought and language, habits of responding or not responding to experience. The philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre has come very close to fleshing this out at the beginning of his influential book, After Virtue. It was written in 1981, 30 years after Dewey died. And it begins with an imaginary scenario, which is designed to shock. He writes, quote, "Imagine that the natural sciences were to suffer the effects of a catastrophe. A series of environmental disasters are blamed by the general public on the scientists. Widespread riots occur. Laboratories are burned down. Physicists are lynched. Books and instruments are destroyed. Finally, a know-nothing political movement takes power and successfully abolishes science teaching in schools and universities, imprisoning and executing the remaining scientists. I should interject that this kind of negative know-nothing reaction is evident even today in the unscientific reaction against vaccination and climate change. But MacIntyre then imagines a counter-reaction against the knee-jerk reaction, and listen to what then happens to the nature of scientific knowledge. Quote, "Later there is a reaction against this destructive movement, and enlightened people seek to revive science, although they have largely forgotten what it was. But all that they possess are fragments, a knowledge of experiments detached from any knowledge of the theoretical context which gave them significance, parts of theories unrelated either to the other bits and pieces of theory which they possess or to experiment in instruments whose use has been forgotten, half chapters from books, single pages from articles, not always fully legible because torn and charred. Nevertheless, all these fragments are re-embodied in a set of practices which go under the revived names of physics, chemistry, and biology." End quote. Now, MacIntyre is describing a state of uncertainty. He says adults argue with each other about the respective merits of relativity theory, evolutionary theory, and phlogiston theory, although they possess only a very small and menial knowledge of each. Children learn by hearing the surviving portions of the periodic table and recite as incantations some of the theorems of Euclid. Nobody, or almost nobody, realizes that what they are doing is not natural science in its proper sense at all. For everything that they do and say conforms to certain canons of consistency and coherence, and those contexts which would be needed to make sense of what they are doing have been lost, perhaps irretrievably. Here now is the point. MacIntyre's imaginary society has lost the connection between science and the experience on which it was founded. In the rest of his book, MacIntyre is suggesting that our knowledge of morals, not science, is precisely in that situation. And that is what Dewey was trying to say about basing morals on experience. McIntyre continues like this, quote, "In such a culture, men would use expressions such as neutrino, mass, specific gravity, atomic weight, in systematic and often interrelated ways, which would resemble degrees in the ways in which the expressions had been used before scientific knowledge had been largely lost. But many of the beliefs presupposed by the use of those expressions would have been lost, and there would appear to be an element of arbitrariness and even of choice in their application, which would appear very surprising. Rival and competing premises for which no further argument could be given would abound." Remember what Dewey said about that. "Subjectivist theories of science would appear and would be criticized by others who held that science was incompatible with subjectivism." This is the situation Dewey was concerned about, where anything goes, including subjectivist claims of absolute values. McIntyre continues with an attack on analytical philosophy. Is very like one that some science fiction writers have constructed. We may describe it as a world in which the language of natural science, or parts of it at least, continues to be used, but is in a grave state of disorder. We may notice that if in this imaginary world analytical philosophy were to flourish, it would never reveal the fact of this disorder. For the techniques of analytical philosophy, says McIntyre, are essentially descriptive and descriptive of the language of the present. Here, McIntyre suggests the criticisms I made in the first lecture about when I talked about analytical philosophy, especially its tendency to see indeterminacy instead of uncertainty, to ignore the actual challenge of conflict and the need to resolve it. McIntyre is suggesting that there are no real experience-based foundations in analytical philosophy. He asks, quote, "What is the point of constructing my imaginary world? Is that the actual world in which we inhabit the language of morality is in the same state of grave disorder as the language of natural science in the imaginary world which I described. What we possess, if this is true, says he, are the fragments of a conceptual scheme, parts of which now lack those contexts from which their significance derived. We possess indeed simulacra of morality. We continue to use many of the key expressions, but we have very largely lost our comprehension, both theoretical and practical, of morality." I think John Dewey, who died 30 years earlier, would have loved this account. It is truly, deeply evocative of the loss of an empirical naturalism, the natural empirical experience-driven process at the heart of scientific knowledge. Now, this is what it would look like if it happened to science. But McIntyre uses this incredible scenario to illustrate a larger point, to explain how desperate he thinks the situation of moral uncertain example, opening insights that are hard to describe in almost any other way. But how could this be so, he says? The impulse to reject the whole suggestion out of hand will certainly be very strong. Our capacity to use moral language, to be guided by moral reasoning, to define our transactions with others in moral terms, is so central to our view of ourselves that even to envisage the possibility of radical incapacity in these respects is to ask for a shift in our view of what we are and do, which is going to be difficult to achieve. End quote. Radical uncertainty is precisely what we need to understand in these lectures. The question posed by MacIntyre is an enormous problem for his imaginary society and for our real society. It is one that requires all our human resources to address, including shocking scenarios like the bullying of middle school children. It requires such scenarios as Kamakami's story, where philosophy itself seems only to reinforce bullying as an unacceptable reality. The meanings of our moral terms may seem clear to us, but only in a sense that is out of touch with what is most important to our contemporary lives. Language itself has lost an adequate connection with reality in the sense of a dynamic and radically changing reality. And we are at sea, as the expression goes. The connection of language and reality may once have existed, but it no longer does so. Is there any hope? MacIntyre asked. Quote, the powerlessness of this kind of philosophy does not leave us quite resourceless, without resources. For a prerequisite for understanding the present disordered state of the imaginary world was to understand its history, a history that had to be written in distinct stages. The first stage was that in which science flourished. The second, they suffered catastrophe. And third, they were restored, but in damaged and disordered form. MacIntyre looks to history, but he is redescribing history. He is describing a long continuum of inquiry that has been derailed by failure. And his new history observes that we are blind to this derailment. He says, quote, one objection to the view of the imaginary world which I constructed is that inhabitants of the imaginary world reach a point where they no longer realize the nature of the catastrophe which they had suffered. Here is a clue to why Dewey was so deeply and gravely misunderstood and often ignored. He was struggling to redefine his own society and culture, as MacIntyre does in After Virtue. Dewey sensed that his culture was deeply embedded in an approach to ethics that was unscientific in the sense of lacking in true foundations. MacIntyre's next comment could have come from Dewey himself, late in life, and after his greatest insights had long been ignored. It runs, quote, I cannot make this palatable, for if it is true, we are all already so disastrous that there are no large remedies for it. Note that he says, no large remedies. By this, I think MacIntyre means sweeping abstract programs. Possible remedies exist, but they are local and particular, as Levy, Dewey, Holmes, and Frank Knight all recognize. So, MacIntyre, like Dewey, is still hopeful. Do not suppose that the conclusion to be drawn will turn out to be one of despair, he says. Angst is an intermittently fashionable emotion, and the misreading of some existentialist texts has turned despair itself into a kind of psychological nostrum. But if we are indeed in as bad a state as I take us to be, he says, pessimism too will turn out to be one more cultural luxury that we shall have to dispense with in order to survive in these hard times. There follows another thought by MacIntyre that Dewey would have agreed with. Quote, I cannot, of course, deny, indeed my thesis entails, that the language and the experience and the appearances of morality persist, even though the integral substance has to a large degree been fragmented and then in part destroyed. The suggestion is that we must find a way to a new language of morality in a situation in which that language doesn't yet exist. That takes us back to the pragmatic definition of uncertainty. It seems like indeterminacy, but to call it that is to give up. Uncertainty should keep us in the game. How can we use this in the midst of our own crisis and put it to use? Well, we first examined the context of Dewey's own time, when it was filled with uncertainty, national and global crises, debate over the role of government, the ideological struggles, world wars, fascism, the Cold War, the anti-communism scare, violent conflicts throughout the 20th century. Given this turmoil, with Dewey under attack by critics like Mortimer Adler, who accused him of undermining absolute values, what chance was there for an organic democracy in Dewey's lifetime? And how about in ours? We've already witnessed the difficulty of habit change. Ideology is based on beliefs, habits, patterns of conduct. We now see today that habits of belief are being widely challenged regarding treatment of women and people of color, of climate change, the problems of poverty. Already language is in flux, regard challenge, and even with the beginning of change being resisted with a fierce reaction. The continuum is a process with stages of inquiry, a path through uncertainty, requiring humility in the face of novel experience and the need for transformation. Yet these elements of Dewey's continuum were ignored in his lifetime, and his call for an ethical empiricism was opposed by moral absolutes. Although he struggled to define his vision of organic democracy, our purpose in these lectures is nevertheless to clarify a vision of public choice and self-government that emphasizes the dynamics of conflict as a greater force than even Dewey recognized. What does Dewey's dynamic process tell us about democracy and how we govern ourselves? And what's the basic difference from the world that MacIntyre decries? MacIntyre's world is stuck in a rigid vision, like the rigidity of Kenneth Arrow's vision, which grew from utilitarianism. Friedrich Hayek's lived a different way, mired in custom, unyielding to rational construction. Arrow and Hayek both pictured democratic decisions as immediate and comprehensive, taking place instantaneously, current preferences or utility calculations, which they held on. The pragmatist account, following the model of law, is that decisions in the context of certainty are tentative and experimental, often local, often particular. Society are rarely ever sweeping and final, even in a national election. Surely, if a mad person who wanted to start a nuclear war got elected, that would be pretty fine. But that's hopefully unimaginary. Mixed preferences can be aggregated mathematically, but how preferences actually aggregate in the current problems. And second, not how custom in general resists construction or constructive rationalism, but how particular customs are generated and reconciled when they come into conflict with each other. In showing how disagreement and dispute contribute to the eventual resolution of conflict, the pragmatist vision is more complex than the conventional one of immediate utilitarian judgment. Instead, it involves gradual, particular transformations of conduct and habit as problems are defined and addressed. This is an account of society as an organic entity, and we are drawing on legal history to model how society actually thinks, how it acquires knowledge. Dewey shifts attention from preferences and custom to problems, which leads us right into conflict. It is problems that lead to dispute and conflict. And as I have said, they require a different way of thinking, a different rationality, a different but nonetheless powerful inductive logic of social dispute and conflict. Induction goes back to Aristotle. We will take it forward to the present in a way that has yet to be recognized in the logical curriculum, toward problem solving and toward a social dimension of inductive logic in Dewey's continuum of inquiry. Arrow and Hayek arrived at their views of democratic impossibility because of the nature of their vision of the world and how it is conceived by human intelligence. Their visions draw on sweeping abstractions that I like to compare with Nancy Cartwright's dappled world. Cartwright is a marvelous philosopher of science. And here is what she says about that world, referring to natural science. Quote, "We live in a dappled world, different things, with different behaving in different ways. The laws that describe this world are a patchwork, not a pyramid. They do not take after the simple, elegant, and abstract structure of a system of axioms and theorems. Rather, they look like science as we know it, apparently arbitrarily grown up, governing different sets of properties at different levels of abstraction, pockets of great precision, large parcels of qualitative maxims resisting precise formulations, erratic overlaps here and there, once in a while, corners that line up, but mostly ragged edges, and always the cover of law just loosely attached to the jumbled world of material things." End quote. Pragmatism's model of the world of law, which, like science, is also a world of thought and conduct, may look to some scholars like a pyramid. But it too is a patchwork, much closer to Cartwright's dappled world. That model recognizes the diverse nature of human problems and diverse responses to them. The world of law, with its myriad legal precedents, is a, quote, world rich in different things with different natures behaving in different ways, as she said. Even so, pragmatism seeks to understand social order within that diversity. It rejects the assumption of a hierarchy of axioms and theorems, but still recognizes the potential convergence of thought and action. It is a patchwork, a network of solutions, rather than a pyramid of theoretical order. And yet, the patchwork can and must contribute to order, to a dynamically ordered world. The world of social knowledge, of both science and law, appears dappled, rather than not a fixed mirror reflecting a fixed reality, but more like an ocean with some areas of calmness or stability. And other areas of swirling, disruptive uncertainty. But those uncertain areas be in the process of becoming stable and calm. The great question is how? Pragmatism escapes the assumption of a universal spectator mind, seeing the world like a camera and not a video camera. Dispute, conflict. It is an account of multiple interactions with the gradual formation of their resulting beliefs. Social conflict is an essential aspect of this model of knowledge. The individual mind. You yourself might go through conflicts to make your own individual judgments about the world. But those conflicts are largely hidden by your mind when you reach a conclusion. Not so with society, where conflicts are. This is not to deny that St. Augustine was right in believing that the world of material events is transitory. However, I believe with the important as well of understanding reality to that better world. How then does this world of conflict into Colossus and Levy? We can actually trace the process of resolving ongoing conflicts as they find their way into legal precedents. The precedents then conflict over application to new problems. Thus, the dappled world of law, its model or vision of society, is one of nodes of stability surrounded by emergent new problems. A legal precedent, such as a simple traffic rule regarding right-of-way, is the result of prior instances of traffic accidents and injuries. A legal right begins life as a practical solution. If the solution is put into practice, and if it succeeds, it can gain legal sanction. However, new situations may arise in which new forms of injury occur. They often draw on unrelated practices. They may also be supported by law. When diverse precedents conflict, they must be resolved. A new problem has arisen. At first, difficult problems go through a stage of uncertainty. Cases arise that have no clear classification under existing law. They appear to lie in between opposing practices, laws, or legal precedents. So the real world is one of constant battles over similarity and their classification. Similarity is a mixed function of description, conduct, and habit. Once a dispute is settled into stable belief, we have deduction from it. Everywhere else, we have a mixture. We might call it induction and abduction. Charles Peirce's word for hypothesis was abduction, for creative intelligence. So that's what we will discuss next time. And the clock has just rung. So this is the end of my...
Professor Matt, for your speech, and I will give some information to the students about the translation, okay?
Thank you.
So,
goodbye.
We need next,
See you
next
week.
Monday. All right.
See you next Monday.
Alô, estudantes, por obséquio, os engajados nesse curso, eu queria informar que a tradução da aula do professor Kellogg hoje será entregue a vocês o mais breve possível. Entretanto, como houve algumas modificações no próprio texto do professor Kellogg, nós tivemos que fazer uma certa adaptação e, por isso, amanhã ou depois vocês estarão recebendo os textos. Muito obrigado e até a próxima semana.